common analogy for viewports, as I noted earlier, is that essentially what they are is they're a window from paper space into model space below. And this is the way and the method about which we're actually going to be given our drawings a scale. So automatically with each layout, you'll see if I click on layout 2, there's a viewport in there too as well. Automatically AutoCAD comes in with one viewport per paper space layout. And we can always add more layouts by going up to our menu, okay? And if you go to the layout menu and under layout viewports, you'll see that there are some options for creating viewports. And you don't have to have one viewport on a sheet, okay? You can have multiple, you can have as many as you want. So again, if I want to create any more, or if I accidentally select my viewport and get rid of it, okay, you can always go up to your layout menu up above, go out to your layout viewports ribbon, and I can click on, for example, the rectangular viewport, and I can specify a new viewport, okay, or I can keep clicking on it and I can create multiple viewports. Okay, so again, as I said, you can have as many as you want. I can move them all around the sheet. Okay, the only limitation that we have is that they have to sit within this area that we've designated for our drawings to appear in our sheets. Okay, so I'm going to select these and I'm going to delete them. Now what we want to do is we want to assign a scale to AutoCAD and the viewports. So I'm just going to stretch mine up a little bit. Hit escape to deselect it. And now what I want to do is I want to start to determine the size of my drawing that I want. Okay. Now you'll see that this also comes in with a grid. Okay. And essentially that grid is your grid from your model space. I can get rid of it by clicking into my viewport. Okay. And what that does is that actually activates my viewport. You'll see that there is a very thick outline of my viewport, and what that means is that I've activated this viewport, that this viewport is actually live, and I could theoretically pan around in it, okay, and I can do other things within it, because what it's doing right now is it's actually activating my model space, okay, and that's something to be concerned of when we start to work with viewports, is we need to be mindful of that, so that if we change anything, okay, so for example, if I'm in my scaled viewport and I activated it, okay, by having this, and you'll see that with the border around it, and I scroll up, okay, that's actually going to change the scale of the viewport, okay. So typically, whenever I get in a viewport and I work in it, okay, I'll always double click outside of it to get rid of that dark line, to deactivate it, so that I'm not working with it, you know, and accidentally do something that I don't want to do. But if you want to get rid of that grid, okay, if you double click within the viewport, okay, this, as I said, is actually in your model space, so I can go down to my drafting settings below here, and I can either hit F7, okay, or I can click on that grid, and that will make the grid go away. And that shouldn't, you know, print anyways when you print, but that's just a graphic display. Okay, now once I want to get out of this activated viewport, I'm going to double click outside and make sure that that bold line goes away. Okay, so that I'm not in or accessing model space anymore. One other thing before we get into scaling viewports is that viewports should always be on their own layer, and you'll find that you know, whatever drawings you're working with, is that typically they do have a viewport layer, and it's usually viewports or VP or VPort. There's a couple abbreviations that you can use in order to signify the viewport. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call it VPort, so that I know those are for my viewports. And you either have the option of making a viewport layer that you can actually print, or you don't have to print the viewport, okay? Again, it's a graphic thing that you'll see when you start to print it out, that you might want to have the viewport showing up, you might not, okay? And, you know, A, it's a function of aesthetics, okay? And B, it's a function of actually using the file too as well. Because a lot of times what happens is that people will print with this viewport, okay? And then what they'll do is they'll actually stretch the viewport to be the full area, oops, of the drawing area in your title block. Okay. What's problematic about this is that when we start to work with symbols and we start to work with other viewports on top of it, okay, and you double click onto that, it could double click into this viewport that's large, okay, and then things start to get a little bit screwy because you're activating things you don't want to activate, and you might, be making a lot of mistakes that you don't want to make, and all because you don't want that viewport to show. Okay, so the easiest thing by far, and this is what I do, is I always try to keep my viewports as small as possible, okay, so that I can work with them, and I can work with any information off to the side, any information on top of the viewport, and then what I do is I put it on a non-plot layer. So if I go back to my Layers Property Manager, and I go into my viewport layer, what I do is I make this layer, and I make it a non-plot layer. So I'm going to click on the plot visibility, okay, and I'm going to make sure that it has that little no symbol. And then usually what I do is I give it a color that's not associated with my CTB file, just so that I know that it's not going to plot and it's not meant to plot. Okay, so I'll change that color to, for example, color 40. Okay, because we know that that's not associated with our CTB file. So I'm going to get out of this, exit out of that, and I'm going to select my viewport, and I'm going to assign it to the viewport layer. Okay, now to assign its scale, this is actually, it's a pretty easy thing to do. Okay, if I click on my viewport, you'll see that what activates down at the bottom are a set of options down here. And you'll see that this is the button, okay, that will determine our viewport scale. And right now, it's given me some weird number, 0.003822, okay? Whenever you see that number, you know that AutoCAD is not giving it a scale, okay? That's just a random number that pops up because that's the number that this is randomly scaled to. So what we want to do is we actually want to assign it a scale, an architectural scale. So if I click on this button and expand that list, you should see that there's a bunch of scales that come in with our file. And if there's not, so for example, you might run into instances where you only see these scales here, okay, the 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 4, so on and so forth. Those are engineering scales, okay, and basically this is associated with the template that you first open up this file with. So if you find that you're only getting these scales, okay, make sure that if you open up a new file, you're not using the one of ACAD ISO, that you're using the ACAD template and that's it, because that's going to come in with these scales, including the architecturals, and that's what we want to work with, okay? These are engineering scales. We rarely work with those. The only way that we do work with those is if we're doing site plans, okay? And what we want to do is we want to stick with our architectural scales. Those are the scales that we work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on, let's say, 1/8, and you'll see that what happens is my viewport scales in, okay? And then this changes to 1/8 scale. And that's how you know that this is actually set up to be 1/8 of an inch. Now, what we can find is that, well, it's too big, okay? Obviously, it's too big. My, plan is not even fitting in there, okay? Not even close. So we need to scale it down a bit. So I'm going to return to my list, and I'm going to click on, usually 3/32 might work, okay? You'll see that it even is a little bit big here, okay? But we want to stick with the scales that aren't so odd, okay? So 3/32 might be one of those. And what we can find also is that with our viewport, it's not going to fit anyways. So I'm going to click on this again, and I'm going to make it a 1/16 inch scale. Now, your drawings might not have a 1/16 inch scale, okay? Again, it's a graphic thing. What actually shows up at a good scale on your drawings? And this is, it's a trial and error thing, okay? You'll practice with it, and you'll get to see, how those different scales come about. Okay, but it looks like 1/16 inch scale is good for this. And you'll see that my viewport is actually off-center. Okay, there's a couple ways that I can do this. I can, in order to make my drawing a little bit more centered within my viewport, is I can double-click Okay, again, making that bold outline and activating this viewport and holding down my scroll button in order to pan and move my drawing up a little bit. Okay, what that does is it just pans it in the view. Okay, it doesn't actually change the location of it in model space. Okay, that's only done if I actually go in and I move it. So what that does is just pans the view within the viewport. Okay, now again, I want to be careful that I don't, zoom in and want to look at something, because now you'll see that that changed my scale. So I want to set this back to a 1/16. Maybe pan in there a little bit, center it a little bit, and click outside of it. Okay, again, I try to click outside of my viewports whenever I'm not working with them as soon as possible. What you can also do is you can also move your viewport. Okay, so if you want to have it in a specific place, you can do that. Okay, and just a couple extra things with viewports is that I can copy them. Okay, so you don't have to create new viewports every single time. Okay, you can copy them, you can rotate them, you can mirror them. Okay, I can do anything with viewports like I would any other object. Okay, so they act like other objects. One other note with viewports is that if I don't want it affected by when I'm moving around my mouse and working with it, is that I can actually select my viewport, and next to that scale list there's a locking button, and I can click on that and I can actually lock the viewport, and what that does is it essentially locks the scale. So I cannot click on it and change the scale. Okay, you'll see it grays it out until I unlock it, and then that'll allow me to do that. So it's another little safeguard that's a nice feature so that you're not accidentally changing your viewport scale.